Hello, thank you so much for coming. My name is Luna. I work alongside Belly of the Beast, which is a platform that seeks to tell the stories of Cuba using film and investigative journalism. This is the third screening of The War on Cuba, or the screening of the third episode of The War on Cuba, which is a short documentary series produced by Belly of the Beast specifically to tackle issues of U.S. sanctions and policy, United States policy that affects the Cuban people. So we've had 3 episodes come out so far. This is the final one. And today we're going to screen episode 3 as well as episode 2, just in case you missed it last week. But as a reminder, both episodes are all 3 episodes are now available on our YouTube. They'll be there forever. And I really hope that you enjoy and leave comments. You can also like, follow, subscribe on YouTube, but also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And also feel free to send us an email if you have any comments or questions or feedback or anything like that. So I also want to thank today the Red Nation for co-hosting this event. The Red Nation is a very important Indigenous resistance organization, and the talk today is very special to us. It's going to be with 3 Indigenous leaders who are leading the way in terms of thinking around sovereignty, freedom, and getting resources back to Native people. Benicia Albert and Julia Bernal from Pueblo Action Alliance both recently traveled to Cuba and have thought a lot around the solidarity between First Nation on Turtle Island, which is now known as North America, with Cuba. And then we're also going to be joined with Nick Estes, who's done extensive work writing and activism around solidarity with Venezuela and Bolivia. So all 3 of them are going to be speaking around how they see First Nation solidarity with the Global South, and also Cuba as well, and what they've learned from Cuba and what we can all learn from Cuba. So excited for that. Also, because Belly of the Beast obviously seeks to educate around sanctions and economic warfare on Cuba, but we also really do want to connect with greater movements of resisting U.S. policy and legislation, which hurt people around the globe. So yeah, I'm gonna screen episode 3, then we'll have a talk, and then I'll screen episode 2. And both episodes are around 12 minutes long. And so yeah, stick around after the talk to see episode 2, or you can watch it on our YouTube, and this talk will also be archived on our YouTube afterwards.
Hi, I'm Liz. The United States has 60 times more COVID deaths per capita than we do here in Cuba. No me sorprende.
Cuba has more doctors per person than any other country. We treat our doctors like war heroes, especially these days.
Estoy segura de que en Cuba vamos a estar bien. 100% confianza y seguridad de la medicina cubana.
Y nosotros confiamos en ellos.
Porque son los mejores médicos del mundo.
Since COVID began, every night at 9 p.m. we cheer for our doctors. Pero fuera de Cuba, todo no son aplausos.
In the last few years, our doctors have come under attack. Every morning, tens of thousands of doctors, nurses, and medical students take to the streets across Cuba. They are on the front lines of our fight against COVID. Talia Ruiz is a first-year medical student.
No me siento con miedo. Nosotros si nos cuidamos y tomamos las medidas necesarias tampoco tenemos por qué contagiarnos. Hay médicos que han ido y se han enfrentado directamente con la enfermedad y no se han contagiado, como por ejemplo mi papá. Hola papá.
Talia's father, Juan Jesus, is a family doctor who runs a small clinic next to their home. In March, he joined a group of Cuban doctors on a medical mission to Lombardy, Italy. At the time, Lombardy was the global epicenter of the pandemic.
Por el número de casos, desbordó los sistemas de salud. Ayudamos sobre todo a ese personal médico que ya no podía ya con ese volumen de casos y salvamos unas cuantas vidas. Caminar hacia el acto de despedida, en todas las casas la gente salía y nos aplaudía. Esa fue la sensación más agradable que he sentido en mi vida. Por esas cosas que uno sale de misión.
It wasn't the first time Juan Jesus risked his life far from home. He's part of the Henry Reeve Brigade, Cuba's medical special forces.
Henry Reeve era un expedicionario norteamericano que vino a pelear en la guerra de 68 para Cuba contra los españoles. Se inauguró la brigada en el año 2005. Un huracán que se llamó Katrina, que acabó con Nueva Orleans, hubo una cantidad de muertos tremenda. Cuba se ofrece en mandar 100 médicos para trabajar conjuntamente con los médicos norteamericanos y ya estábamos listos.
George W. Bush rejected Cuba's offer to help New Orleans. Since then, Juan Jesus has treated survivors of natural disasters and epidemics around the world. In 2014, he fought Ebola in Liberia, West Africa.
Nos decía en la calle, ¿no? Ustedes están locos, se van a morir todos allá. La epidemia del ébola es una enfermedad muy letal y vamos asustados.
¿Por qué someterse a ese tipo de condiciones?
Por el afán de sentirse útil, sentir que salvaste una vida. Cada vez que pienso en que es probable que no me hayan pagado mucho, yo nada más que me acuerdo de las caras de las personas que se salvaron, ¿entiendes? Nosotros teníamos un niñito que se le murió a la familia entera y nosotros éramos su único sustento. Usted sabe la alegría de verlo a él todos los días vivo. Eso es como si te pagaran mucho dinero.
Cuba's international medical program began in 1960 when it sent a health brigade to Chile in response to a deadly earthquake. Since then, Cuba has sent more than 400,000 medical personnel to 164 countries. For decades, Cuba's medical missions were purely humanitarian. The government didn't charge a penny. Today, Cuba still sends thousands of doctors to poor countries in Africa and Latin America at no cost. But in the last 20 years, Cuba has also begun charging wealthier countries. Under some of these deals, Cuban doctors receive about 25% of what the host governments pay. About 75% goes to the state. The money pays for free healthcare in Cuba. 30,000 Cuban healthcare workers now serve on missions in 59 countries. For years, US officials and Florida politicians have criticized Cuba's medical missions. Since Donald Trump was elected, they've intensified their attacks.
Okay, so the allegation is that Cuban doctors are being sent around the world to work in different places.
These Cuban medical missions, if you'll call them, are really just disguised human trafficking.
We've noticed how the regime in Havana has taken advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to continue its exploitation of Cuban medical workers.
This business of forced labor is the functional equivalent of modern-day slavery.
USAID offered $3 million to organizations that would investigate alleged race relations of Cuban medical personnel overseas. But the campaign against Cuba's international medical program had little impact until November 2018.
And the breaking news is the far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro has won Brazil's presidential race.
Dubbed the Donald Trump of the tropics.
With a history of making racist, misogynistic and homophobic comments.
He also talks up dictatorship. President Trump tweeted about it this morning. We agreed that Brazil and the United States will work closely together on trade and military and everything else.
Bolsonaro wasted no time in denouncing Cuba's medical program.
Jamais faria acordo com Cuba nesses termos. Isso é trabalho escravo.
É difícil. After Bolsonaro's comments, Cuba removed its doctors from Brazil. It was a big blow to Cuba's health system, which lost hundreds of millions of dollars in annual income. Cuba's doctors were also affected. In Cuba, you don't have to go far to see a doctor, porque en cada comunidad vive y trabaja uno. Mario Diaz is a family doctor. 2 years ago, he was in Rio de Janeiro when Bolsonaro won the election.
Donde yo estaba, que era ciudad, nos recibieron muy bien, por la diferencia del trato que da el médico brasileño al médico cubano. Los tratamos como personas, como un igual, no es una mercancía. No es que yo lo atiendo para coger dinero. Nosotros caímos en zonas que médicos brasileños no quieren ir a trabajar. Zonas de pobreza y lugares incluso que nunca tuvieron un médico.
¿Cuánto gana un médico trabajando en Cuba?
Tú tienes un salario básico, que es de 1.740 pesos. Allá ganaba $700. Es una diferencia ostensible, ¿entiendes? Entonces te da para mejorar tu vida. Es verdad que el gobierno de nosotros, el sistema de salud, se quedaba con una parte de ese contrato. Pagaba por cada médico cubano 12.000 reales, nosotros recibíamos alrededor de 3.000. Pero lo invierte aquí en obras sociales, de la reparación de las instituciones de salud, de la compra de materia prima para producir medicamentos en nuestro país. No es que se lo coge el presidente. Tú lo miras desde el punto de vista personal, a lo mejor lo ves como injusto, pero tú piensas en algo más grande y ves que tiene un beneficio para el país. Hay un dicho aquí en Cuba que nosotros usamos que es que el ladrón piensa que todo el mundo es de su misma condición. Ellos piensan que todo el mundo gira alrededor del dinero nada más. Y no es así. Yo quise ser médico siempre. ¿Para qué? Para ayudar a la gente. Eso no es porque voy a ser rico. De hecho, yo vivo aquí mismo donde trabajo. Yo me encuentro con mis vecinos en la cola de la tienda.
¿Dónde entra Estados Unidos en todo esto?
Bolsonaro siempre siguió la línea del presidente americano. A él le dicen el Trump latino. Estados Unidos quieren ahogar la economía cubana para tratar de lograr un cambio político aquí en la isla, ¿entiendes? Cuando Cuba se retiró del programa, alrededor de 1.700 municipios quedaron de un golpe sin médico. Así. Yo tuve la experiencia de un paciente mío allá en Brasil, un señor de alrededor de 70 años, analfabeto. Y él marcó consulta para ir a despedirse de mí. Y lloró aquí en el hombro mío.
Millions of Brazilians in poor communities were left without health care. It was just the beginning. Ecuador's president became a Trump ally, and then, in November 2019, he expelled hundreds of Cuban doctors. That same month, a US-supported coup ousted Bolivian President Evo Morales. Bolivia's de facto government immediately took aim at the Cuban doctors.
Los falsos médicos cubanos.
Nos acusaba de que no éramos médicos, nos acusaba de bandidos.
Joandra Muro was head of the Cuban Medical Mission in Bolivia.
Amenazaban con quemar la casa de los médicos cubanos, a otros los llevaban a la Interpol, a 2 de nuestros compañeros los apuntaron con armas, revisaron a nuestras mujeres, algunas las desnudaron.
Cuando sucedió lo de Brasil, el argumento era de que los médicos cubanos eran víctimas, hay los pobres médicos cubanos que son esclavos del gobierno de Cuba. Sin embargo, el discurso respecto a Bolivia cambió. Ya no eran víctimas, sino que eran victimarios.
Siempre van a buscar algún argumento para llegar al mismo fin, que es desacreditar. En Bolivia no podían hablar del dinero que Cuba recibía. En Bolivia cada colaborador recibía un estipendio de $800, pero era un pago directo al colaborador. A Cuba no le pagaba.
¿Qué usted cree que está detrás de todo esto?
Ya había una comunicación del propio gobierno de los Estados Unidos de una agresión abierta y además financiada para atacar la colaboración médica cubana. El carro que estaba allí frente a nuestras casas era un carro de la Embajada Americana. ¿Qué hace un carro de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en el momento que nos están deteniendo a nosotros como médicos cubanos?
After Joandra returned to Havana, she became the head of ELAM, the biggest medical school in the world.
La Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina es una escuela totalmente gratuita. Hemos graduado más de 30.000 jóvenes de 117 países y ya tenemos 198 graduados de los Estados Unidos. El mundo necesita médicos.
In the face of the global pandemic, Cuba's international medical program has grown. The Henry Reeve Brigade has sent nearly 4,000 doctors and nurses to more than 30 countries to fight COVID. But the Cubans were still not welcome in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil.
In Bolivia, the healthcare system there has been overwhelmed by the coronavirus pandemic.
Hospitals are at breaking point. People aren't just dying in their cars, they're also dying on the street.
Ecuador is seeing one of the world's worst coronavirus outbreaks.
Corpses wrapped in plastic and left on the sidewalk in Ecuador.
Brazil's infections are rocketing, particularly among the poor.
They're digging thousands upon thousands of graves.
Brazil now has the second highest number of cases and deaths in the world.
Even during COVID, the Trump administration has pushed other countries to kick out the Cuban doctors. And Trump cut funding to the Pan American Health Organization for supporting Cuba's health program.
Pajo must explain how it came to be the middleman in a scheme to exploit Cuban medical workers in Brazil.
Even with so many doctors fighting COVID in other countries, Cuba has contained the pandemic at home.
Yo atiendo en esta zona 952 pacientes y no he tenido caso de COVID. El punto fundamental de que el COVID no haya sido una epidemia inmensa en Cuba ha sido la pesquisa y el aislamiento de contacto. Mi hija pesquisando, la pobrecita, subir y bajar escaleras no es nada grave, pero es lo que le toca.
¿Qué edad tú tenías cuando tu papá se fue a la primera misión?
Cuando yo tenía 1 año ya estaba cumpliendo una misión. Es tu papá y quieres tenerlo aquí y sabes como que sientes que te falta algo. Con el pasar de los años vas entendiendo la situación, que ese es su propósito en esta vida. No es un médico simplemente cubano, es un médico del mundo. Mi sueño es ser un médico tan abnegado y sacrificado como lo es mi papá. Hay muchas campañas difamatorias, sobre todo de parte de los Estados Unidos, pero al final todo es mentira y al final nosotros estamos seguros de que ellos son héroes, son gente con un corazón inmenso que aman lo que están haciendo.
¿Usted ha notado un cambio entre las actitudes del gobierno de los Estados Unidos con los médicos cubanos en los últimos años?
Hay una mayor hostilidad respecto a las misiones médicas cubanas.
¿Por qué están haciendo eso?
Fácil, es parte del bloqueo. La Henry Reeve es muy altruista, hace las misiones para servir a los demás, pero hay misiones que si eran remuneradas, que Cuba recibía dinero de esas misiones. Ese es el objetivo fundamental del decreto de los médicos cubanos. No porque le interese la cantidad de horas que trabajemos, sencillamente para privar al país de otra fuente más de dinero.
¿Acaso el gobierno de los Estados Unidos no tiene suficientes problemas que resolver para andar preocupándose por nosotros?
Some people say the blockade isn't a big deal, that our economic problems are only caused by our government or by socialism.
If that's true, ¿por qué no quitan el bloqueo?
So that was episode 3 of The War on Cuba, which is a short documentary series produced by Belly of the Beast, which tells the story of Cuban people and the effects that U.S. interventionist policy has on everyday life. I'm now really excited to introduce my 3 guests. And again, this whole event was co-hosted by the Red Nation, so we want to thank again for the solidarity. So my 3 guests, Benishi Albert is a leader from the Yuchi and Anishinaabe nations. She spent a lot of her life working for environmental justice and elevating First Peoples' rights in the United States. She was a founding member of the Native American Voters Alliance and a lobbyist for Strong Families New Mexico. And while in New Mexico, she also served as co-director for the Southwest Organizing Project. Benishi is now Indigenous Environmental Networks movement building coordinator with It Takes Roots and with a global collaboration on strengthening grassroots feminist movements, along with Grassroots International, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and the World March of Women. Nick Estes is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. In 2014, he co-founded the Red Nation, an indigenous resistance organization. His research engages colonialism and global indigenous histories with a focus on decolonization, oral history, US imperialism, environmental justice, anti-capitalism, and the Ocheti Chacowin. Estes is a member of the Oak Lake Writers Society, a network of indigenous writers committed to defend and advance Ocheti Chacowin, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota sovereignty, cultures, and histories. And Julia Bernal is an enrolled tribal member at Sandia Pueblo, but is also from the Taos Pueblo and the Yuchi Cree Nation of Oklahoma. Her expertise is in water resources policy management and community regional planning at the University of New Mexico. Julia has contributed her analysis on environmental issues in New Mexico with her expertise in water and environmental policies and organization. She advocates for the decolonization of water policy and stolen water resources, and she's helped Pueblo Action Alliance build campaigns against carbon pricing, fracking 101 education, and the reclamation of indigenous water management practices. So without further ado, thank you to my three guests. Okay, so thank you all for joining me. I'm so appreciative. Everyone on this panel has a really close connection with New Mexico, which is, I have a very close connection with too, so this is a very special event for me. And of course, Belly of the Beast is very grateful for the Red Nation to co-host and for all three of you to be guests. It means a lot to me. So first I wanted to just talk about the connection between Indigenous communities and Cuba. Beneshi and Julia, you both have been to Cuba, and I was wondering if you could speak to what that experience was like for you, and also the ways in which being in Cuba challenged your politics in any way or stretched it in any way.
So I'll give it a try. I've been twice. I went to Cuba the first time in 2008. 5 days after Obama was elected to office. And that was the first time I went. And then I went a year ago, actually around this time, in late October, early November. And, you know, the first time I went, I think I had all the different expectations, but the first thing that struck me is I've grown up in a landlocked state. And so going to an island was a bit of a cultural shift for me, and but a beautiful experience for sure. And, you know, so the two things that struck me the most was that we weren't able, on the delegation that I went with, they had intentions of connecting with some of the people who still identify Indigenous on the east side of the island. And we weren't able to make that connection, and they were very apologetic to me the whole time. But in lots of communities where I went, there was lots of cultural practices that were very familiar, and very much about, you know, feeding people, and the protocol around food and opening up space was very familiar in terms of Indigenous culture here, or Indigenous culture that I was accustomed to with my family. And so that was really cool. And, you know, I was like, wow, there's a lot of, even some of the structures and older structures, you know, having round council houses and different things were very similar. I come from one of my tribes is from the Southeast, so there were some similarities that were kind of cool to see. And then the second was, you know, how politically astute regular people were, right? They were just had a politic that was sharp and quick, and that was just mind-blowing to me. You know, when like I said, I was there 5 days after the election, and so many people knew who were being nominated for the cabinet, and I had no idea. They were like, well, what do you think about this person? What do you think about? I was like, how do you know that? Like, I don't even know that. But they had an access that was just like phenomenal. And then, you know, just the pure like care, kindness, and love that people had. I think one of my assumptions though is that coming from the US, that people would have some animosity towards me as an American, right? But nothing like that, nothing of the sort, just pure kindness and care and generosity. And that was the good, I mean, those were the things that impressed me the most.
Yeah, Benicia, I think I have a similar experience. I just have to say this to me and Benicia are Beliuchi with a Y. So, you know, we represent a very small population of Indigenous people here on Turtle Island. I went to Cuba the summer of 2019 with the Venceremos Brigade. I was selected to go on their 50th anniversary contingent. And it was interesting because, you know, this was during like the Trump administration and a lot of his undoing, you know, of what Obama had put into place when it came to embargoes, U.S. sanctions. He reenacted the Title III Helms-Burton Act. But luckily, we had already, because of these complications of the Trump administration, we had our trip already licensed. So we were kind of grandfathered in, basically, for us to travel to Cuba. And, you know, similarly, I'm a land shark. You know, I'm from I'm from the desert. I'm a Pueblo person. Never really been around water too much, so being on an island was definitely something very overwhelming in the best way possible. I immediately felt like Cuba was probably the safest place that I've ever traveled to. As like an outwardly Indigenous person, my existence is very political, so traveling to different places is always very risky, even within Turtle Island. So when I went to Cuba, it felt like a big reservation to me. This hospitality that the Cubans have towards visitors resonated with me as a Pueblo person, being that a lot of Pueblo traditional customs and core values do revolve around sharing food, welcoming people into your homes, expressing, gratitude, sharing meals together. This sort of thing was very welcoming. And also just the fact that Cuba's revolution is only but 60 years old, that they're a very new country, and their willingness to learn and transform was something very new to me, being from the belly of the beast. Like, our government systems do not recognize where their faults are, and in fact, it's actually more efforts to erase the wrongdoings that they have done in the past, to rewrite this whole entire narrative of what being American is like. That wasn't the case in Cuba. We had very many open conversations about racism, about even their lack of acknowledging Taino culture and in the original indigenous people there. But there was this willingness to learn. We even brought like the custom of like giving our gender, our pronouns, our gender pronouns, and that was something that they didn't really practice there in Cuba, but actually started to exercise that practice as well. So it was just really cool to see the openness and also just the hospitality that their culture also has, similarly to Indigenous cultures here.
Thank you for sharing, Julia. And also I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your specific trip there, because my understanding is that you were part of the first delegation of Pueblo people to go to Cuba, and that you taught a little bit about the Pueblo revolt.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to say that we were the first delegation of Pueblo people, but it was definitely like the first meeting of Pueblo people with the Instituto, with the ICAP, the Instituto Cubano de Amistad con los Pueblos. We were there was just me and my coworker, brother Sheldon, you know, representing like Pueblo people like in Cuba at the time. And we wanted to be able to provide like a real cultural exchange, not just us taking from Cuba, but also us giving to Cuba as well. And so when we went on our trip, we brought literature on the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which is actually, you know, one of the first revolutions that has ever actually happened here on Turtle Island. And that, you know, we were proud to be in Cuba as Pueblo revolutionaries, as Pueblo nationalists, because we carry the spirit and the revolution of 1680. And invited different compañeros within that delegation, within ECAP, and some of the other folks that came from Albuquerque to help us moderate and translate a conversation around the Pueblo Revolt and what that battle and the organizing of that meant to us, and how that moment in time actually was like the catalyst for our politicalization and attempts to mobilize Pueblo people and teach them, you know, that revolution, and that it happened, and then actually we won, you know. And it wasn't just like a military win, but it was spiritual. It was it had all of these different components in it. And you know, when we were having these conversations, these cultural sharings, I didn't realize that it was a historical moment until other people were saying that that's what was happening. And to me, that was just like basically just the foundation of this relationship that we have with Cuba, like forever. You know, we will always have friends in Cuba, and they will always recognize, you know, our existence as Pueblo Indigenous people. And so I was just like really blessed and grateful to be a part of that exchange.
Thank you. And I want to talk more about this solidarity and the like possibilities for transnational solidarity. And I also wanted to highlight this article written in Mother Jones in May by Comrade Kaylin Goodluck, writing about how the Navajo Nation was the epicenter of COVID-19 at the time. It had surpassed New York and New Jersey as having the most COVID cases. And there's this quote I loved: "Decades of negligence and billions of dollars in unmet need from the federal government have left tribal nations without basic infrastructure like running water and sewage systems, along with sparse internet access and an underfunded Indian health service." And that was a really like heavy reality. People of color broadly were neglected during, and are broadly neglected during the COVID-19 pandemic, but specifically Indigenous communities. And at the same time, like because of the film we just watched, we know that Cuba, that has like also intense access issues, have been able to have superb healthcare and treat people who are poor and who are Black and who are campesinos, and everyone is treated, and they've actually have a lot to offer, and they're actually able to go to other countries and treat other people too across the world who are poor or have lack of access. So I wanted to talk about this healthcare, Cuban healthcare, the possibilities of solidarity around Cuban healthcare. and the importance of just healthcare in general, specifically for Indigenous people on Turtle Island, what's now known as the United States.
You know, two things I will share about that. Like when I went to Cuba in 2008, I was telling one of my relatives about it when I came back, and she said, "Hey, do you know Uncle Ted went to Cuba?" And that was her uncle, but my stepfather. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that. And and he went to Cuba in like the late 70s and was talking to some of the groups and agencies there around sending doctors to sovereign nations. And I don't know what ever happened with that project, but even when I was in Cuba in 2008, one of the agencies we went to, they were like, listen, we have all of these slots. They were doing 100 slots for US students to attend medical school for free, right? And they said most people don't know that there is a parallel capacity for 100 slots of Native Indigenous students to attend if they want to. And she was like, we've been trying to connect and trying to figure out how to connect to make that happen. And I was like, my mind was blown. I was like, oh my God. And I left 3 kids at home when I went to Cuba. It was really hard, but I was convinced one of my kids was going to go to school in Cuba. That didn't happen, but I was like, I'm sending one of them to Cuba to go to school. And then the second story I'll share is when I was there this last time, I was there in November for the La Jornada, the intercontinental meeting around anti-imperialism. Was a conference of solidarity and democracy, and people who were standing against neo-fascism and neoliberalism. And so while I was there, I got sick. I have asthma. My asthma, like I had a pretty acute crisis. And the first night, I was in a taxi cab with some local folks and we were going somewhere else, and they kept saying, just stop in. And I was like, no, it was like 11:30 at night, right? And I was like, no, I can't go. Like, I don't have any money. I don't have any car. Like, they're like, no, just go. And they made the taxi driver stop and take me in. And I was in and out of that facility with a cortisone shot in like 10 minutes. Like, it was literally like that. And I realized that my whole idea and concept of even getting care was wrapped around the cost and the money to have care, right? So the idea that I could go in the middle of the night and just pop in was foreign to me. It was absolutely foreign to me. And they were like, no. And even the taxi driver was like, no, there's one right around the corner here. We're gonna stop. I mean, literally every 3 blocks, there is a clinic in each and every neighborhood.
So
and then,
you were a foreigner and you were treated for free?
For free. They asked me my name, where I was from, and they treated me with full care and had me come back the next day for treatment. And they told me, you're in crisis, you need to come back. So I went for like 3 days. The challenge with that was one of the medicines that I needed to take because I was in crisis is also embargoed, right? So it became a real conflict because there were local people outside of the medical field who were trying to find the medicine for me that was not in any of the pharmacies because it was a medication that was embargoed from the US. It was prevented from having it there. And so I had this conflict because I knew that people locally there didn't have access to that medicine. Yet local people were trying to find somebody who might have had extra pills to give me for that medicine. And it caused me a huge conflict because I was like, I have access. I come from one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and I have access to this medicine when I get home. Yet people were generous enough to say, we're gonna find it for you. And it was a team of like 4 local women who, they found the medicine, and then I was fine. I was there for like a week, but the rest of the days I was fine because they were able to find it. But it was a real conflict for me to feel like wow, the country that I come from, who is preventing this medicine from coming to Cuba, yet the local people are saying she needs it and we're going to find it within our network. And they did. And that was a very important moment for me to think about how, even when I think about like access to healthcare with the Indian Health Service and what's supposed to be free and provided to us, it's still wrapped up in capitalism. It's still wrapped up in the cost of what does that mean. And so what that means by way of cost is like, it's a challenge, or it's like, if I go into the hospital in the middle of the night, I'm sort of looked at as wanting something that is not, that I'm not supposed to have. That's how it is. That's how we experience here in the US, even under the system that is supposed to be free for us as Indigenous and Native peoples.
You know, Benishi, that it just speaks to the medical system being based on the good for humanity. That's what the revolution is, you know. The revolution is for the good of humanity, and it's exuded and exemplified in their medical care system. I mean, you talk about IHS. I mean, IHS is serving like over a million Indigenous people, and yet we're 3 times more likely to have diabetes, heart disease. You know, we're 40% more likely to like die before like the national average. You know, like our age limit. We have an age-adjusted death rate. You know, we're definitely one of the more disenfranchised groups of people, you know, on Turtle Island. And yet in Cuba, it's a right. It's a human right to have access to healthcare. It's a human right to have access to education. You know, the doctors in Cuba don't become doctors because of the pay. They become doctors because it's their passion. It's that they want to be doctors. They want to save people. You know, one of our you know, one of the health issues that we struggle with is mental health, you know. And I asked that, we visited a children's hospital, and, you know, I asked, you know, that what does mental health look like in Cuba for young people? You know, we have an epidemic here in Turtle Island of our youth, you know, taking their lives. And when I asked that question to the doctor, he was saying, you know, I know about this, that this is happening in your country. I know that this is, you know, an issue that you all are dealing with. But here in Cuba, you have acts, and he's like, you know, we do have cases like that, but not to the extreme or the detriment that you all experience, you know, on the mainland. A lot of it speaks to how society in Cuba is structured. You know, you have the right to healthcare because they care about your health and well-being. There isn't any sort of gatekeeping in the pharmaceutical industry either. I mean, I went into a pharmacy in Cuba and I could get over-the-counter medicine to cure cancer. I mean, that to me is just like amazing. I mean, I had friends on the contingent who, you know, this was like their second or third time coming to Cuba, and they brought back, you know, that cancer medication to their loved ones, and who are now living cancer free. You know, we visited a pharmaceutical company who were utilizing medicinal types of medicines to create vitamins to send to Africa to combat hunger and famine. You know, humanitarian and philanthropic kind of organizations will send grains and rice and bread over to Africa, thinking that that's what's going to address, you know, the hunger issue. Whereas in Cuba, it's like, how do we get our African comrades healthy? You know, creating vitamins to send over to Africa to, you know, get their immunities boosted. You know, that sort of kind of thinking, medical advances is just so centered around humanity and the good of humanity, that we definitely don't see here in Turtle Island.
I think you both hit on some really good points. Specifically, there's a connection between what the United States does to Indigenous people and what it does to the rest of the world. You know, even as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are not like biologically more susceptible to COVID-19, right? But there's a popular myth within the United States specifically around the killing off of Indigenous people at the hands of biological agents, right? And it's often this myth of a biological inferiority, ignoring the imposed conditions of war, invasion, starvation, and malnutrition, right? That are the result of invasion. And we can see that now being exported to the rest of the world through, you know, 1/3 of humanity being the subject to US imposed sanctions, and specifically, you know, a 6 decades long sanctions campaign and blockade against Cuba. So with this in mind, you know, and recognizing the importance of a more equal world, many of us are being pushed to deepen our understanding of US imperialism and the ways the aggression and war abroad mirrors the ways colonization is maintained in native land here. So how can we use these lessons learned to build solidarity abroad?
I think the greatest opportunity for solidarity is independence. You know, I think Cuba has many, many lessons to teach us about independence and what does that mean, and liberation, and what does liberation mean. You know, part of the delegation that was with us they were from Puerto Rico, right? And we got to share some different thinking about occupation and what does occupation mean for us. And I think, you know, one of the realizations from this more recent time that I went was deepening my own understanding around the difference between sovereignty, self-determination, independence, and liberation. And many times in our Indian community, we talk about those things as basically the same. Most people say, oh, sovereignty is, you know, self-determination. And, you know, both talking with the folks from Puerto Rico and from Cuba, I started to realize that there is real distinction between those. And that, you know, while here in the US, we may have sovereignty, but sovereignty is the recognition of another body of us, right? So it's a recognition from the federal government saying, we're going to recognize that you are a people and we're going to work with you in that way. Self-determination is we are, right? We just are in being. But independence and liberation are different, right? Independence is us being able to live outside of the control of that federal system, right? And that federal system is in the U.S. context, it's driven by a corporation, right? It's driven by profit and capitalism. And so the idea of becoming independent is based on economic models that will always put us at a disadvantage. So what does it mean then to like be liberated from that? What does it mean to like liberate ourselves from that federal system? And what would it look like then for us to build real independence on an economic system that was truly indigenous, right? It's not about like the economic system can't function within the confines of capitalism. But there are models that exist, right? They're part of our biology as indigenous people, right? And so I think this last time when I was there, I really started to unpack that for myself a little bit more of what it means to not just be sovereign, right? Sovereign, I mean, even sovereignty as a term comes from like the church, right? And you're being, ordained as sovereign by biblical text, right? But we've come to hold that to mean something else. And I think at some point, tribes are going to have to come to terms, in the US context anyway, of what it means to be independent and independent of the federal system. And, and it's a struggle because it's a tension between holding the federal government responsible and accountable for agreements they made with us in treaties, and deconstructing and undoing that system as we're trying to hold their feet to the fire, right? Those two things are in constant tension all the time. And, I think the idea, though, of building solidarity is really around this relationship with independence. Cuba has many lessons to teach us about that independence and that liberation. Puerto Rico is fighting for it. Guam is fighting for it. All these countries, right? Hawaii is fighting for it. And us as Indigenous people in the mainland and all the way up to Alaska, they're fighting for that independence. But not only them, as Indigenous peoples of the global South are fighting for that independence. And much of that control comes from US corporate influence of trying to exploit the land and exploit the people. So.
Yeah, I think I want to expand this idea that Benicia is bringing up about solidarity and independence, because even with the restrictions that Cuba is under, in result of US sanctions and embargoes, their, again, moral kind of foundation is, again, very centered around humanity, which leads them to exercise international solidarity. But more so than that, it's actually nationhood building. I see it as. You have Cuba with limited resources sending delegations of doctors abroad to help people. You've seen, even in times of war, Cuba sending militaries to Africa to help liberate Africans from colonization, colonialism. You had them going to Mexico, you had them going to Bolivia, they were always there to show up for the struggle of Indigenous people, of poor people, of disenfranchised people, of displaced peoples, because they believe in liberation for all. It's not just liberation for Cuba, it's liberation for everybody. Liberating meaning that there is no longer an imperialist control over self-determination, and I know that there's a debate over using the term sovereignty, and I understand that. But here, just even on Turtle Island, you see examples of nations, Indigenous nations, exercising, I believe, it to be sovereignty and self-determination, and it's a step to declaring that independence, because unfortunately, we don't have the infrastructure to be independent from, the US empire. Unfortunately, we depend a lot, again, on the medical system to help us, but when I was there, I was lucky enough to go to a biotechnology research facility, and learn about the facilities and the research around embryonic medicine. And Cuba, with its resource limitations, is one of the leading countries for biotechnology. They will literally shut down, they will turn off the lights, they will turn off the air conditioning to save energy, but continue to research. I mean, to me, I mean, that's just revolutionary in itself. But in that lecture, one of the doctors was like, you know, we see people with diabetes, but we will never amputate. That was just, I was blown away. I mean, even in my tiny tribe in San Diego Pueblo, how many relatives of mine I had seen with no toes, no feet, no fingers. The fact that they have the research and technology to never amputate basically opened my whole eyes in that, like, if indigenous nations knew that this type of medicine, and they do, and there's examples of like the Akwesasne Mohawk tribe going to Cuba to learn about, you know, their medical systems for solutions for type 2 diabetes. I mean, you have also Navajo Nation, you know, going to Cuba also to learn about, you know, the medical research there. If we are able to have nation to nation building to help us build infrastructure, whether that's human infrastructure, physical infrastructure, medical infrastructure, we would be able to declare independence from the US empire. Same thing goes with water. You know, here in the Southwest, one of the biggest issues in New Mexico is water infrastructure. If we don't have that in place, then we cannot actually declare independence from the US empire. So what I'm trying to say is just that if indigenous people had more access to these opportunities to build nation to nation with other anti-colonial, anti-capitalist nations, then that is the stepping stone for independence from the US empire.
Yeah, those are both really good points. And you know, the next kind of question that I have revolves around a larger question around, you know, indigenous people. We're often thought of as just like local cultures. We're not really thought of like as geopolitical actors in many ways. But you know, with the sanctions campaign on Cuba and the targeting specifically of indigenous lands for oil and gas development, that does put us on a global scale and actually makes our, you know, movements to protect land, water, and air part of a global anti-imperialist movement, specifically that are you know, used to undermine nations such as Cuba and Venezuela. And so, for example, in the United States, you know, my cousin, he was just elected to tribal chairman in Lower Sioux tribe. We're tiny, small tribe. We're the smallest Lakota tribe, but we're the tallest people, right? But he just got elected, and the day he got elected, he got a letter from TC Energy, formerly TransCanada Energy, which is developing the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, and is also constructing the Keystone XL pipeline through. It's the northern leg. There's the southern leg that already goes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, but it's constructing it through our territory. And on top of offering jobs, you know, investment opportunities into the pipeline, the kicker of their invitation to the Lower Brule Sioux tribe is that TC Energy will recognize our sovereignty, as they're violating it at the same time. But it's this really fascinating thing. But
as they exploit it, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, so there was an article that came out in Counterpunch by Lee Schlenker on October 19th, which was this Monday. And I just want to read a quote. It says, he writes, "One of the most infamous billionaire Cuban-American clans responsible for decades of subversive and legislative attacks on Cuba, the Moss family, similarly amassed much of its wealth from fossil fuels. Patriarch Jorge Mas Canosa, who founded the Cuban-American National Foundation in 1981, founded Mastec, a publicly traded construction and engineering firm focused on energy, utilities, and communications infrastructure. Self-styled as one of the largest Latino-owned businesses in the United States, Mostec's profits rose more than 90% in 2017 due to high demand for fossil fuel pipelines, including its role in building a major section of the Dakota Access Pipeline. End quote. And so here you have a clear profiting from this anti-Cuban, lobbyist group in the United States from indigenous lands by building this fossil fuel infrastructure. And so, the war in Cuba, this documentary series, deals with U.S. imperialism towards Cuba, and episode 2 deals with how U.S. aggression towards Cuba, towards Venezuela affects Cuba, which, Venezuela is one of Cuba's major trading partners. Mm-hmm. We also know that there are ties between the profit and corporate oil industry, or corporate oil, and the exploitation of native land. Can either of you speak to this connection of fossil fuels and potential for solidarity?
So, Julia's in New Mexico, I'm in Oklahoma. So we might have a arm wrestling match of which one of us is in the belly of the beast in terms of oil and gas development, right?
Who gets cracked more, Oklahoma or New Mexico?
Yeah, I used to feel pretty strongly that Oklahoma was one of in the belly of the beast in terms of oil and gas development until I went to tar sands. And then I was like, holy shit, this is way next level, right? It was really hard to just drive through that community. I mean, on the way there, and just how much, everywhere, that hotels and restaurants and everybody's business was about supporting oil and gas development. But I live in a state that, not this governor, but the previous governor instituted a statewide day of prayer for oil fields. It's October 15th, so just last week. We have a statewide day of prayer for oil fields. That's the absurdity of how entrenched it is. And when I went to Cuba in 2008, with much of some of the same organizations that Julia probably went with. And we did lots of prep beforehand, right? And I remember one of the videos that we were asked to watch was around peak oil. And I remember that concept kind of blew me away when I watched the video, and I was like, wow. And so, yeah, it's this concept that as much as we're gonna, exploit the oil petrochemicals, we've hit the highest, and it's gonna start steadily going down, and the cost is gonna, the economy is gonna change because of that. And so, when I think about Cuba and Venezuela, in the US relationship, the US is not, pushing back against Venezuela because they're not doing it right. They're pushing back because they're not doing it the way they want it, right? And the US wants it. They want to have access, they want to have free access, and to be able to control the leadership to have free access to those petrochemicals. But in terms of the people, people are starting, not just Venezuela, but other countries, people are starting to stand up against that. And, the tricky thing with us in the US is the governance system is constructed in such a way that it prioritizes corporate interest over people's interest. We the people doesn't mean anything anymore. We the people doesn't mean anything anymore, especially when corporations can be recognized as people, right? And so, when decisions are being made about the people, it's always about the interest of oil and gas development as an industry, right? And people are always with the work that I do with Indigenous Environmental Network, right? People sometimes are like, oh, you guys are just anti-workers. No, I'm not anti-workers. I want people to have work and livelihood, but you cannot compare people having livelihood with people being able to live, right? Those are dynamically different things. That's like comparing oranges to Saturn, right? It's not the same. That you can't do it. And so I think that's where, we can try to learn some of the lessons from Cuba, just of how they've been able to survive and shift their economy, right? Not only shifting the economy, but shifting the way people work, shifting the way energy is used, the way petrochemicals are used. I mean, for the most part, commercial farming in the US is based on petrochemical fertilizers. They don't use that in Cuba. Most of the food in Cuba is organic by default because it's too expensive to use petrochemical fertilizers to grow food. And so, can we get there? Yes. Can we get there tomorrow? No. But we can get there when we start to shift what it is that we are using as our means of economy. And we have to start producing and showing that this can exist. And for the most part, it means decentralizing the economic base. We can't have our economy based on large scale commercial food, or everything is like massive. You can only have something if it's a large scale anything. And I think that's a system that is not going to sustain us. We've already seen that it's not sustaining us. I mean, we're all dealing with climate change because of that system. So that's all I can say about that for now.
It's tough. Just in Oklahoma, there was a mass relocation of indigenous peoples from like the Georgia southern area to Oklahoma because the U.S. government leadership at that time viewed Oklahoma as this wasteland, until they found oil underneath it. That was a story within my own family. Same kind of similarly to what's going on here in New Mexico. We're an extremely resource-rich landscape, not just oil and gas, but uranium is huge here. Gravel. There's a lot of gravel pit mining here in New Mexico, and now because of climate change, there are other capitalist ventures to commodify air and carbon capture, which is something that I know IEN has also pulled Pueblo Action Alliance into a lot, because New Mexico is kind of like the industry is on New Mexico because of the large land masses that we have, and it all comes down to capitalism. This exploitation of resources and people is an infinite like economic gain. Cash crops here in the US, we have a shortage of water here in the Southwest. I don't believe it's entirely because of drought or anything like that. A lot of it is because water is allocated for big agriculture. Look at the Imperial Valley in California. I mean, the Colorado River Compact is basically formulated around profits, for big ag. And speaking to just like corporate interests, I mean, obviously it's always going to be like consolidating the wealth and then exploiting the poor. But what's great about Cuba is like there are conversations about like how are we going to be more sustainable in the future, even though we don't have resources, like even we don't even have like the secure importation of oil and gas. It's very corrupt. You'll have gas that's being shipped in by cargo ships, and the US will tell them, if you deliver to Cuba, don't even bother coming to the US, because like we will not do business with you. And they'll just go right past Cuba, and there's like months and months of oil and energy. But again, like the resourcefulness that Cuba has shown us, has displayed to us, is this actual just transition. They're looking at bioenergy, they're looking at wind, they're looking at solar, they're looking at those things right now in order to have the autonomy over like what their energy grid is going to look like. And I feel like Indigenous people, we should have that same opportunity to decide what our energy grid is going to look like in the future. I mean, here in New Mexico, you have the Power New Mexico, the PNM, you know, they have a whole monopoly over New Mexico, as, you know, everybody has been, you know, using PNM for God knows how long. And Indigenous people asserting clean energy plans for the future is also a way that we're going to help build our infrastructure and gain that independence, you know, from the global capitalist market, because that's what it is. You know, it's global capitalism, especially with resource extraction. I mean, you know, specifically with like carbon pricing and carbon markets. I mean, you are just going to continue, big polluters are going to continue polluting while you're offsetting carbon like on the other side of the globe. And people that are like progressive and liberal will see those as solutions to mitigate climate change, but will not see that it is another capitalist venture. And Indigenous friendly communities are going to be the ones that are exploited, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be impacted again and again and again. And so I think like community level type of governance is needed when it comes to like energy, you know, and also just refuting a capitalist market when it comes to energy. And when it comes to resources in general, we should use what we need, not what is going to make us the most money.
Thank you so much for saying that. I want to highlight something that I think is so important about this conversation is the real like recognition that these struggles are really connected across borders and also across struggles. So something that I am very well aware of, well, there's two things. First off, that young people really are very passionate and really care about gender violence and combating gender violence. And I think most young people know that there's intense violence against specifically trans, Black, and Indigenous women. And a lot of something, Nick, you mentioned to me last time we spoke was just so clear and true, but we don't always like really remember it. But you can't be against the the disappearance of Native women and be pro-fracking, because we know that this happens because there's man camps that are there because of the oil industry. And then in the same grain, we can't be against fracking and then be anti-Cuba. The way that the United States is, or anti-Venezuela, the way the United States is creating a foothold and creating coups and creating, just sowing chaos in different places where they want oil, in the Middle East and Latin America, wherever, it parallels and it mirrors what's happening within in the belly of the beast too. And then at the same time, also we have this idea, a lot of young people across race, across gender, really care about climate change. And it's something that it's a ticking talk, there's an urgency around it, and we all care about it. But as you have all highlighted during this talk, the capitalist model is not going to work. And a model around like, creating jobs just to create jobs is not sustainable. It does not allow for sovereignty. It doesn't go back to, if we care about giving land back, it doesn't actually like fulfill that need. So I wanted to ask everyone, what does the future look like? What is like a good solidarity? Like what is the future of solidarity? And then I also wanted to, maybe Nick, if you could speak about the Green New Deal alternative that the Red Nation has, because it really inspired me. And I think it's something that in episode 2 that we're going to watch, I'll just say, in episode 2 that we're about to watch, Cuba they talk about one man who runs CUBA Solar. He talks about his like dream to make Cuba completely solar sustainable, because he says they can't blockade our sun. But then he says, we can't be solar sustainable because we can't get the solar panels here because of the blockade. And it's just like, we literally do not have, we have all of the knowledge, we literally do not have the resources. But it kind of speaks to like this greater idea of just making alternatives that aren't based in capitalism and also are not like completely dependent on fossil fuels. So I just wanted to hear, okay, so the future of solidarity and also alternative to the capitalist kind of ways of mitigating climate change.
Well, I'll jump right in and offer some brief thoughts. I guess my foray into this entire conversation and how I actually learned about the blockade against Cuba was through the blockade and the sanctions against Venezuela. Because one winter, when I was back home living on my reservation, the propane man came, and it's cold. We live in the northern plains. It's cold. The propane man came and filled up our heating tank, and I was like, "No, dude, like, don't do that. It's really expensive." He was like, "No, it's cool. There's this new program. Everybody's getting a full tank of heating oil." And I was like, "What the heck?" And so I looked at it, and it was this like little paper, and it said something about Citgo, and I was like, "What the heck is Citgo?" And so I looked it up, and Citgo, was the U.S.-based oil company owned by the Venezuelan government. And at the time, people, from the northern plains and from the northern part of the United States, like people like Vernon Belcourt, went to went to Venezuela and visited with Chavez to actually kind of broker an aid package, a heating aid package for northern reservations that pay high price in oil, right? And these are some of the poorest places in North America. And I was like, who's this guy, Hugo Chavez? I had heard about, Evo Morales at the time. But that actually stuck with me. And I had the opportunity last year to actually thank Venezuela for doing that, and I actually learned about this revolution, the Bolivarian revolution, through that assistance program, because it put, even though it was like a fossil fuel based form of aid, it put people's needs before profit, right? And that's something that stuck out to my mind. And while I was there, it was also at the time, at the beginning of the coup against Bolivia, right? The right-wing orchestrated US-backed coup against Bolivia. And, the Red Nation had began to think about this new program called the Red Deal. And it wasn't really a counter program to the Green New Deal, so much as it was trying to reinvigorate the 2010 People's Accords that were drafted in Cochabamba, Bolivia, by indigenous people that are far more revolutionary and much more far-reaching than the Green New Deal. Because it's not about necessarily repairing capitalism in a way that it can transition out of fossil fuels. It's actually trying to reevaluate the problem, from a perspective of the global South, saying that the consumption-based economy of the United States is not a pathway for the rest of the world. Because if the rest of the world consumed the same amount of oil and carbon that the United States did, we would need 3 planets to survive, right? And also, going back to, I think it was what Benishi had said, is that under our current corporate government model, peoplehood is granted to corporations. Whereas in the plurinational Bolivian constitution and the People's Accords, it grants the rights of nature. The rights of nature actually arose from that specific agreement itself. So in 2019, when the golpistas overthrew the Bolivian government, the democratically elected government of Evo Morales and the movement towards socialism, they actually overthrew that eco-covenant as well, embodied in that particular document. And so all we're really doing with the Red Deal is translating that document into the current moment, right? About a divest and reinvest strategy, but also in centering indigenous worldviews and knowledge, and understanding that a consumption-based lifestyle is not an alternative, but it's about living well, and that's encapsulated in the Indian kind of cosmovision of like Pachamama, as well as Vivir Bien. And what's happening now, or what happened in the last year, was an attempt to get at those lithium reserves in Bolivia, because Bolivia has been denied the technology to even develop its own resources for the benefit of its own people, right? And you had Elon Musk, going on Twitter saying we will coup whoever we want. And so when we talk about the alternative vision for this planet, and we have to look and see that Bolivia is actually leading the way. It's not against development; it's for development in a way that benefits the humble people of the earth, right? And even though it's not to say that there weren't mistakes made. Of course, we can learn from that struggle, but are you going to just enjoy the party and the victory of the struggle, that just happened this week with the election of Mas? Or are you going to be in the struggle itself and engage those contradictions? And, this is a call out to the people in the first world, especially young people who are getting, activated in climate policy. We have to understand that being against sanctions, economic sanctions against other countries so that they can develop their own green technologies is part and parcel to any kind of climate deal that's going to happen in the future. And it begins with, I would say, more recently with that 2010 People's Agreement. And that's really what the Red Deal is. But looking at it specifically in the context of the United States, as a hyper-capitalist country where there's mass incarceration, and also the hyper-militarism of the rest of the world. The United States is literally holding back the freedom for the rest of the world. And it begins by addressing the prison system, the military bases throughout the world, as well as the sanctions campaign against other countries and not letting them deal with such easy problems like the COVID-19 pandemic.
So yes, all of that. I mean, I think, so here's the thing, like, if we continue to look at solutions for climate change and the climate crisis we're in from an economic point of view, we're never going to erase it, right? We're never going to, you can't mitigate the crisis that we're in by saying, oh, well, if we just try to erase this little bit, we can still produce this whole mass. Like, you can't keep bringing in buckets of coal into your house and feel like your little dustbuster vacuum cleaner is going to like deal with it. You have to stop bringing in all of that stuff, right? And so, I think the Green New Deal, when it was first conceptualized, was thinking of trying to do something radically different. I think it was trying to do that. Since then, like, everybody, right, left, right, they're all putting in a whole bunch of, like, there's like now 10 versions of the Green New Deal out there. For us, we've been trying to look at it from this perspective of, our principles as Indigenous people for a just transition. What does it mean for us to, switch to a different economy, a different way of being, a different existence? And we feel like that the sort of cultural teachings and perspectives of Indigenous people could lead the way to shift to models that would live and exist in that system, right? And so if you couple that with what's going on in Venezuela and Bolivia and in those places, I think there is an opportunity to create a new economic system. I could care less what you call it, right? It doesn't have to be Green New Deal. We've been sitting with this concept around regenerative economy, right? Or, and economy is not just about the money, right? We've in the US context, and for the shortcomings of our education system here in the US context, economy has meant to be about money. But economy is about how we manage what we have and care and keep of what we have. And so I am not interested in an economy that says, I have this pet peeve when I go to the cities, right? When I go to New York or DC, all of the office buildings are all lit up at night. There's nobody in them, but they keep them on for security reasons and the cleaning crew. And I get the cleaning crew part, but turn the lights off, right? But no, it's like, oh, it's safer. It's more, it's more secure if we leave the lights on. So then you're saying, to have that access of that kind of consumption at the expense of the homelands of Indigenous peoples, I am not about that economic system, right? We have to have something that says, how do we live in a way that what we have is consumed in a way that is respectful and resourceful and within our means. But right now, capitalism is a system that has to continue to grow in order to be viewed as effective, right? There has to be growth every quarter, every month there has to be, so it just continues to consume. And at some point that will implode, and it will implode at the expense of poor people, and not just indigenous peoples for sure, but it's also going to be at the expense of a lot of people. So I think that is where this idea of solidarity, not only with other people of color, with Black liberation, with indigenous liberation, but also connecting with the indigenous liberation movements of the global South, with the land movements in Africa, with the land movements in Brazil, right? So I think we're going to get there, but it's not going to be an easy path to get there. And I think the challenge with us getting there is, how can we hold and represent what is important for us as indigenous people, and at the same time, you know, to let go enough to include all people as part of what we need. And I think that's a challenge. It's a challenge that we face as a multicultural movement, is how do we hold what we know we need to make sure is our self-interest in that, but also be open enough to connect and relate with other peoples who may have self-interests that are different than ours, but just enough aligned that we can shift and move and push back against imperialism and capitalism.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what I would say would just kind of echo what was already being said. But you know, just from a person, I mean, my field of study is within the sciences. You know, I'm in water resources, and a lot of our discussion is around climate change. You know, we are seeing, particularly here in the Southwest, you know, we're going to start seeing issues of precipitation patterns changing. You know, less snowpack in the mountains means less runoff, you know, during the spring. And you know, like climate is increasing, temperatures are increasing. So, you know, water infrastructure to store water is also going to be like a very important issue in the future. And, you know, Luna, you spoke to just this mass youth movement around climate change, and this urgency, you know, that young people have to ensure that we have like an environment that is healthy. And unfortunately, we live in capitalism, so everything we've known is capitalism. And so at times we are stuck within finding solutions that revolve around capitalism, you know. And one of my main kind of concerns in just, you know, the continuation of the US empire is that, you know, say we are even to get a neoliberal into office, I feel like the exploitations of resources could actually get worse. For this urgency to have green technologies will continue resource exploitation even worse. And again, indigenous peoples will be the first impacted by that. I mean, lithium mining in the Congo, and also like in the global South, you know, to manufacture, you know, batteries for cars and things like that, it's going to continue even worse. So, you know, I think it's mostly important within like the climate change movement that climate justice and being anti-capitalist means being anti-colonial. We can't continue cycles of resource exploitations even in green capitalism, you know. And so with that too, again, being in the sciences, I have my whole academic experience has been like very market-based economics for how like water is used, how water is allocated, and this and this and that. Also, just the fact that and Indigenous perspectives when it comes to land and water management practices has been completely erased. And to me, being in this field, traditional ecological knowledge and feminist, Indigenous perspectives on water and land management is like the way to mitigate climate change. It's the only way to mitigate climate change. And that's what we have to push for. We have to push for young people to create solutions that are outside of capitalism, that are outside of colonialism, that center Indigenous perspective, that center spiritual and natural law, and that cultivates traditional core values. I mean, as a Pueblo person, I was always taught, what I take from this land, I must give back. And reciprocity isn't taught in the sciences. Critical race theory isn't taught in the sciences. And so when you're talking about a climate change movement, you know, we're missing the intersectionality of race movements, of environmental justice and social economic justice movements. I mean, we're unfortunately, we're siloing a lot of these movements, and we're not seeing things in a holistic manner. And that's going to be like the division created, and that's going to be what halts us from actually achieving, you know, the goals that we need to achieve in order to have clean water, air, and clean soil as well. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and also bringing up water. Such an important issue that I think, you know, like being on an island, sometimes you forget, but there are places in the world that people can no longer live in because of the climate, because they literally don't have access to water. And I also wanted to highlight something everyone has kind of spoken to, and the story, Nick, that you told about Sitco is so like phenomenal in a way, because it really gets to like material solidarity. And I'm in the arts, I'm a cultural organizer, and there's a lot of, I've noticed a lot in my life of solidarity around the culture, and exchanges around cultural exchanges and stuff like that. And I'm through like learning more about the embargo, sanctions, war, I've just had to learn and being forced to learn that like actually material solidarity is so important. And while we can hold this vision of the world we want, we also have to address people's needs. And then Benishi, with your story about how you went to Cuba and they were looking for the medicine for you, like for me, like that's material solidarity. They were literally like, we need to look for this medicine for this person so that they can get well. And I think that it's just such an important, so I also just wanted to, Nick, something you said the United States is literally holding back the freedom for the rest of the world. And that's really important for me and for Belly of the Beast, because when it comes down, like at the end of the day, let's be real, like Cuba cannot develop in the way that it should be able to because of these specifically like very tangible needs that are not being met, very tangible resources that it does not have. While we do want to, we have like a tendency to put countries and people and leaders on pedestals. At the end of the day, like there are so many issues that arise when there is a 60-year blockade on a country, and they have the best doctors in the world, but they can't get the very, you know, the medicine that should be easily accessible. The reason Belly of the Beast exists as a platform is to try to get young people to understand the impacts of sanctions and the importance to have a movement against sanctions. Movements against sanctions should not just be for older people, for older white leftists. It should be something that all young people are engaged in. It should be something that we really care about, because just like Bolivia is leading the way in terms of what a actually green future could look like, you know, if there is another coup, if there's another international like disaster that happens, that can be taken away again. And And so I just wanted to like leave it with that, just saying that like the the movements of solidarity with people in the global south who are suffering physical and also economic warfare is something that young people in the United States should really care about. And yeah, I appreciate all of you for speaking about it today in such beautiful depth and sharing your knowledge, and also for sharing your hope for the future. I feel very hopeful, because I oftentimes don't feel very hopeful. Spending a lot of time in Cuba is really difficult, but I do feel like there is a lot of movement and just like vision for the future, and I think that's really good. So also, if anyone, I also want to know if any of you guys have anything else you want to add or say.
Just real quickly, just listening to you talk, sometimes as people who, you know, are involved in these movements, we often talk in the negative about like what we're against. And what I always, you know, encourage people to imagine is like, imagine Cuba without the blockade, what it would be like. Imagine what Yuchi would be like without US imperialism. Imagine what Sandia, you know, Tiwa lands would look like without being under the, you know, the boot of the police state. It would be a beautiful, like, you know, it would be a beautiful society that would be constructed in a way that we can't even imagine in this moment in time. And so that's what I encourage people to think about, is like, think about how much humanity is being held back by these kinds of things. And we really only have the future to win. And the incredible amount of like human diversity and human ingenuity that goes into fighting, you know, not just for this future, but actually implementing it in real time, is something that we should really pause and respect and honor, and especially in this moment in time.
The thing that I will say that I was struck by what you were saying, Luna, was about, you know, Cuba doing, you know, what would it look like if they had the resources? And I think for me, the most hopefulness that I had is, look what Cuba has done without those resources, right? And look what they've done without like massive amount of money, like without like making profit on like whatever. And so for me, that leaves me with some hopefulness of, you know, if Indigenous people in the US or in the north, you know, the northern part, North America, you know, that gives me a thinking, a model of what the possibility is. Even if it says, all right, I'm done with the economic support from the US federal government, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to do it with our resources, with our, you know, with our land, with our peoples. This is what's possible, right? And so I think that's the thing that, you know, makes me move forward, is this is what can exist, because it did exist for our people before. This is what can exist even in contemporary times, because Cuba is doing it, Guatemala is doing it, like Venezuela is doing it, like all these places are doing it without this, you know, corporate drive that has to be about money. And I think the challenge is being able to like share that possibility with more Indigenous peoples, for them to see that opportunity of like, oh, we can do this without large amounts of money. It's going to be tough, but we can do it. And we know we could do it because all these other places are doing it. And Cuba is one of those beacons of what is possible, even with the barest amount of resources.
Yeah, I just kind of thought about something that one of my friends from Acoma, he had quoted an elder in his community, Acoma Pueblo, and he said, "We're so far behind that we're ahead." And to me, I think Cuba's the same way, you know. We have a Venceremos Brigade New Mexico committee here in Albuquerque, and we do a lot of outreach and awareness around like Cuban issues, against US sanctions. you know, all across like the globe. And we always say like Cuba's from like the future, you know. And I think Indigenous communities are also from the future, you know. You know, unfortunately, the word decolonizing has definitely been co-opted by Western academia, but to me, and to Pueblo Action Alliance, decolonizing is also this resurgence of Indigenous identity. And that's what Cuba did. There was a resurgence of their own Cuban identity that led to revolution, and it succeeded. And they're doing that now, and they're creating a way of life that meets the needs of their society. And they're doing it in a way that revolves around core values that Indigenous people share, you know, the good for the community, humanity, to have clean air, to have clean water, you know, to be happy. Indigenous people, we have a right to enjoy being who we are. And it would be beautiful, as Nick would say, to have a identity that wasn't so political, you know, that we could actually just exist in our original territories and thrive like we once did, you know, pre-colonial. And I'm not saying that decolonizing is moving backwards, because I don't think that I don't agree with that. You know, we have technology, we have innovation, we have creativity, and we also come from our own communities, so we have an investment in the future of our communities as well. So, you know, I do enjoy being on these different types of discussions and panels, because, you know, we get to share nation to nation, you know, our ideas and our thoughts and our dreams, and we can co-vision, you know, what our future is going to look like, and we'll lay like the stepping stones for the many generations that are going to come up behind us. You know, we always say, like, within our group here, you know, we may not see it actually happen, but at least we'll leave footsteps that others can follow in behind us, you know. And that's something that gives me hope too.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think that this is a really important conversation, and that it should continue. And I also will say, like, there are opportunities for Indigenous youth to study in Cuba, and also you should hit up Venceremos. They do give scholarships to Black and Indigenous people, young people, to travel to Cuba. And that's a very important, I think, opportunity if people can. And also, if there's any questions around opportunities to be able to study or travel to Cuba, you can also write to Belly of the Beast. I think it's a very important place to study critically, intentionally. It's a beautiful place to travel to, but intentionally is always the best way. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing us together.
Hi, I'm Liz.
Because of COVID, Havana is on lockdown right now. There is no public transportation.
If you wanna get somewhere, toca caminar o montar bicicleta.
But we are used to this. Back in the 90s, we stopped getting oil from the Soviet Union after it collapsed. There were massive fuel shortages, and we had to move around without cars or buses. Last year, we got hit by another energy crisis, but this time it was different. Vista Hermosa is an organic farm on the outskirts of Havana. No chemicals are used on its animals or crops, and recently they've even stopped running their tractors, but not by choice.
¿Ustedes reciben combustible del Estado?
Hoy por hoy, digamos que un 5 o 10% del que recibíamos hace algunos años. Nosotros teníamos 2 tractores acá en la finca y están siendo sustituidos por la tradición animal. La tierra que usted pudiera lograr arar en una hora con un tractor necesitaría un día con un ayuntewey. Debido a las escaseces nos vimos prácticamente obligados a convertir la finca en una finca agroecológica. Pero en las grandes siembras, el petróleo es el eje de todo. Esto va a traer consecuencias graves para la producción de alimentos para el pueblo.
¡Ese palacio!
Havana's markets still have fruit and vegetables, but a lot of basic foods have become hard to find.
Están entrando menos camiones, está entrando menos mercancía también, y la calidad no es la misma, porque mucha mercancía se está echando a perder en los campos, no hay combustible para los camiones.
No están permitiendo la entrada de los buques petroleros por el bloqueo que tienen hecho a Cuba.
The US embargo or blockade has been around for 60 years, but it got worse last year when the Trump administration began blocking oil from getting to Cuba.
Out of Havana, where there appears to be some kind of gas crisis.
El combustible escasea en Cuba una vez más.
You can see the long lines.
En estos días no nos va a entrar combustible.
The Trump administration is sanctioning the ships who deliver that fuel.
La isla dejó de recibir el petróleo subsidiado de Venezuela.
The U.S. wants to stop the oil trade between the two political allies.
Cuba used to depend on the Soviet Union for oil. Now, we depend on Venezuela. 20 years ago, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. Cuba and Venezuela became close allies. Venezuela has more oil than any other country in the world. But their healthcare system needed help. So the two governments made a deal. Venezuela sent us oil, and we sent them my mom. I'll never forget the day my mom flew to Venezuela on a medical mission. It was my 10th birthday and I was so sad. I couldn't understand why she left. I do now. Cuban doctors who go on missions can earn more than 10 times their normal salaries. When my mom came back, she remodeled our house and bought a new refrigerator and television.
Incluso pagó por mi fiesta y mis fotos de 15. That's a big deal in Cuba, and it's not cheap. ¿Por qué te fuiste a Venezuela, mami?
Me hice médico, cuyo objetivo fundamental precisamente era brindar ayuda a las personas que lo necesitan, y era muy difícil decir que no. Y también porque no te lo voy a negar, motivada también por el aspecto económico. Era la primera vez que nos separábamos y realmente fue muy difícil para tu madre, prácticamente con el alma rota, dejando una niña de apenas 10 años, de lo cual me iba a perder muchas cosas de su crecimiento, pero no solamente fui yo, fuimos tantas las que dimos el paso al frente y realmente no me arrepiento.
¿Te parecía justa la cooperación que tenían Cuba y Venezuela, es decir, el convenio entre los dos países?
Yo pienso que sí, que fue justo. Nosotros le brindamos salud y ellos estaban muy necesitados de eso. Y también era justo para nosotros porque recibíamos petróleo, también muy necesitado por nuestro país.
This troika of tyranny, this triangle of terror stretching from Havana to Caracas to Managua, under President Trump, the United States is taking direct action against all three regimes.
In 2017, Trump named John Bolton as his national security advisor. Bolton is a neoconservative known for pushing for U.S. military intervention around the world.
So you've called for regime change in Iraq, Libya, Iran, and Syria.
The decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein was the correct decision.
Secure route to preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons is to change the regime in Tehran.
The way to end the North Korean nuclear threat is to end North Korea.
Under Trump, Bolton began working to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Until recently, Venezuela exported more oil to the United States than anywhere else. Why topple a government you are dealing with? In 2005, Hugo Chavez began providing cheap oil to countries throughout the Caribbean. Venezuela's oil diplomacy offered a way for countries to be less dependent on the United States, and it helped Cuba reduce the impact of the blockade. But this South-South cooperation threatened U.S. hegemony. John Bolton began talking about the Monroe Doctrine, which dates back to 1823.
the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well.
The Monroe Doctrine basically says the Western Hemisphere belongs to the United States. It's been used to justify US invasions in Latin America for more than a century.
Send the troops! We seek a peaceful transition of power, but all options are open. Nothing could be better for the future of Venezuela, and nothing could be better for the future of another captive nation, Cuba. Thank you, Mr. President.
But US-led regime change in Venezuela failed. So the Trump administration began accusing Cuba of having sent troops to prop up the government of Nicolás Maduro.
The dictator Maduro is a Cuban puppet.
The people of Venezuela are essentially Cuba's hostage.
Cuba is the true imperialist power in Venezuela.
If this afternoon 20 to 25,000 Cubans left Venezuela, I think Maduro would fall by midnight.
There are 20,000 Cubans in Venezuela, and most of them are health workers like my mom.
The idea that a poor country like Cuba is propping up an oil-rich country like Venezuela is crazy, pero la verdad, poco importa.
Trump used this as an excuse to block oil shipments from Venezuela to Cuba.
Queremos agradecer la conciencia profunda del pueblo venezolano, pese a las criminales persecuciones.
Lo único que falta, y no lo van a hacer porque estamos muy cerquita, es tirarnos una bomba atómica.
Luis Berriz found a way to lessen the impact of the U.S. oil blockade.
Todo esto es energía solar. El aire acondicionado, el ventilador, las luces, las computadoras, el televisor.
Luis promotes renewable energy through CUBA Solar. It's an organization he founded during the oil shortages of the 90s.
Estos son paneles fotovoltaicos también hechos en Cuba. Produce lo suficiente para una casa promedio en Cuba. El problema no es disminuir los consumos de electricidad. Yo diría que es al revés, aumentarlo con las fuentes renovables de energía, no con petróleo extranjero. Tenemos que aprender a usar lo que tenemos. Y lo que tenemos es esto. Lo que tenemos es nuestro sol. ¿Cómo me va a bloquear el sol?
Luis's use of solar energy is inspiring, pero es la excepción, no la regla. ¿Sus vecinos también aprovechan la energía renovable así?
Desgraciadamente no tanto. Esos paneles son del gobierno. A mí no me costó nada. ¿Cómo lo puede conseguir otra persona? Primero, no puedes. ¿Dónde yo compro un panel? Si en la tienda no hay nada, no se vende. ¿Y por qué no se vende? Pues precisamente por el bloqueo. Tenemos el conocimiento para poder hacerlo. No están los recursos. Ahí donde están los problemas.
Resources in Cuba are scarcer than ever. And not just because of the oil blockade. The private sector was already in bad shape after Trump stopped U.S. tourists coming to Cuba.
¿Está disponible? Entonces me puede llevar.
Sergio became one of Cuba's first bike taxi drivers 25 years ago during the energy crisis caused by the fall of the Soviet Union. As bad as things were then, Sergio says there are worse now.
Casi siempre había clientes. Ahora no. Y puedes salir a los lugares. Te puedes parar aquí, te puedes parar allá, que es por gusto.
Sergio doesn't depend on gasoline or tourism, but his clients do.
Con todo, haga un vuelco. El ciudadano cubano está perdiendo su poder adquisitivo.
¿Y quiénes son sus clientes?
Son trabajadores también por cuenta propia. Carpinteros, albañiles. No hay economía como para contratar a ese albañil, a ese carpintero. Es decir, si no hay economía para pagar a ellos, yo estoy prácticamente sin trabajo.
Si bien la crisis de combustible genera que ustedes tengan una mayor demanda.
Sí, una mayor demanda. Pero había una crisis general de casi todo. No era solamente la falta de combustible. Era un bloqueo total sobre todo. Ojalá y esto termine.
In Cuba, we are used to getting by, one way or another. We call it resolver. We take junk and make it useful, and we use what we have to survive and improve our lives. We are tough, resilient, and we need to be. The oil blockade was just one part of the economic war against Cuba. There would be more to come.